The panel today, the second panel, so as I say, I'm Jussi HANHIMAKI, I work here, so that's that. And I've been working here for the whole millennium, so it's a place I sort of know. But I'm very proud to be here for the annual Du Bois conference and to be able to chair one of the sessions of the conference, which the session is called Panel 2 Regions. And we have 4 presenters. I'm just briefly going to introduce them, and then we'll go in the order of the program. We will have our first presenter online. Hello, Nicole. And then after everybody's done, we will have the Q&A. We have quite a bit of time, I hope, today. We have till about 3 o'clock. So I think we will have plenty of time to discuss the issues that come up. So just in terms of our panel, so Nicole ABOITIZ, who is online. Hi, Nicole. Comes from Cambridge University. And her talk will be the overlapping regional and transimperial at the turn of the 20th century in Southeast Asia. I'm just going to say very quickly introduce the panelists. If you have probably in your packages the full biographies, all of that, you can study those at any moment. After Nicole, we have ANNE-ISABELLE Richard from Leiden University, who will talk about interwar, European cooperation, global, transimperial, regional approaches, question mark. And then followed by ALEXEY Miller from St. Petersburg University, who will talk about competition, cooperation, restraint, and interconnectedness in a macro system of continental Europe. And last but surely not least, HARALD FISCHER-TINÉ from ETH, right? Zurich, whose talk is titled Clash of Empires or Changing of the Guard, American Influence and Involvement in British India, circa 1900 to 1940. So one very distinguishing feature, obviously, of this panel is that we have the longest titles for each of the papers in the entire program. But beyond that, we have 4 wonderful presenters, and I will now pass this on to Nicole, who will join us online, I guess, from Cambridge.
Thank you so much. I'm actually joining from the Philippines. And I apologize if my talk seems a little rough. The Philippine elections have sort of taken over our lives here, to great disappointment to many of us. I'm also thankful that I'm here again. I was here last year, and I feel very grateful to be this floating orb above all your heads, as I was last time as well, sort of Wizard of Oz style. So with that, I'll begin. So my contribution to this was basically just trying to think through some of the overlapping regional and transimperial scales at the turn of the 20th century in Southeast Asia. And a good number of transnational phenomena are better conceptualized as transimperial. But while interrogating this insight in Asia at the turn of the 20th century, where were the concepts of the regional? And the region points to constellations of connection, competition, and cooperation that exceed and subtend empire, and that point to a longer history of Asian relations that in the region did not squash. And actually, one of the things that I found most interesting when thinking through this was the ways in which actually the transimperial and the regional coexisting can actually bring into greater relief one another. So especially thinking through how the transimperial can not only sort of co-constitute the regional, but also sharpen its definitions and distinctions, I think, in Southeast Asia. So one of the examples I was thinking of was, when the French and the Chinese interacted with the Qing Empire, intellectuals in this period, how do we conceive of it as a transimperial encounter or a regional one? Yet by the same token, at the same time, the distinctly transimperial politics of comparison, the specter of comparisons that Benedict Anderson conceptualized through Jose Rizal's writings in the Philippines, played a role in constructing ideas of region in Southeast Asia. And we see this in the Philippine propaganda movement's mapping of and relating to Southeast Asian neighbors through colonial overlords. So treatises and studies of those living under British rule versus those living under Dutch rule as ways to kind of map out different geographies of political affinity and understanding Asia in a different scale and their place within it, the relationships to different entities in the region, creating a kind of region, a kind of regional frame. We see it as well in the Pan-Asianism of the Philippine Revolution that followed. I'm doing the most sort of hesitant and exploratory kind of thinking through of this, these kind of overlapping frameworks of transimperial and regional. But I think it was really, rather than resolving the two scales, seeing the ways in which they actually bring each other into better relief through their coexistence. So, the end of the 19th century and beyond in Asia is often apprehended in a bilateral framework that privileges relations with the West at the expense of the broader historical regional context. And both Junko Koizumi's article, The Last Friendship Exchanges Between Siam and Vietnam, and John Crawford's Journal of an Embassy to the Courts of Siam and Cochin China illustrate this. And despite the treaty arrangements that France imposed upon Vietnam, the courts of Siam and Vietnam remain deeply entrenched in their traditional interstate relations, the meanings and symbolism of which were no less vital to their conceptions and enactments of sovereignty for the presence of the West in their territory and in their worldviews. Indeed, in some cases, they gained greater importance as the remaining scale in which they could continue to perform older rituals of sovereignty in an increasingly and sort of nearing the Western imperial international order. The levels of official intra-Asian diplomatic exchange that Koizumi studies and Crawford evidences show the continuity of cultural and regional planes below and around the imperial plane that was beginning to dominate Asia in this period. And there's a sense even of a concept of sovereignty and kingship that is enabled now only within the explicitly regional plane, now suddenly demarcating the regional with new emphasis as the imperial international encroaches. And despite super-regional imperial structures, demands, and interventions into the local within and geopolitical above, when intra-region interactions did occur, they enabled the regional powers to resume and continue their relations as regional powers. This reminded me in structure of the theorization of the Tokugawa Bakufu governance that Luke Roberts developed in Performing the Great Peace. This idea of outside and inside, and how in their own political space, the daimyo were able to exercise a measure of autonomy and could employ self-referential terminology that heightened daimyo status relative to the national Tokugawa. But in contrast, in the omote space, in the outside political space, Tokugawa power, national power, was acknowledged to be supreme, both legally and rhetorically, and how these overlapping compartments don't need to be resolved, but can simultaneously exist. These divergent realities can simultaneously exist. And of course, the situation is a little bit different in Southeast Asia, and doesn't exhibit this fuller structural sense of outside, inside, omote, uchi. But it's an interesting framework to keep in mind about overlapping and simultaneous regional and transimperial frames as we discuss all these different terms today in different scales. The two exist simultaneously without needing to be resolved. And for the part of the Filipinos in the 19th century Filipino discourse of the propaganda movement, which first constructed the idea of a Filipino nation, so, as I said before, they treat their neighbors and sort of come to understand and define their neighbors in this point and map them through their colonial overlords, or as fellow Asians or Malays, but not as Southeast Asians. And in the newspaper, La Solidaridad compared a lot of the British colonies in Asia as a whole to those of the French. And apart from Thailand, at the time there appeared to be no other model in Southeast Asia. So in kind of constructing what would come to be this structure for Southeast Asia as a region, regional interactions were necessarily trans-imperial interactions at this point. And of course, Southeast Asia doesn't emerge as a coherent regional entity until further along in the 20th century, but also to foreground the subversive anti-colonial Pan-Asianism that emanated from the Southeast Asian periphery, as distinct from that which emanated from the Cynic East Asian center of Pan-Asianism. I anachronistically attend to it in my studies. And I do so also to highlight the shared colonial experience and trans-imperial kind of comparison, interaction, and anti-colonial collaboration and discourse that does help to form the basis for a more coherent political region of Southeast Asia later in the 20th century. Yeah, this sort of anti-colonial consciousness and transnational pan-Asian thinking and engagement is a historical force in the creation of Southeast Asia as a self-identified region. And in this way, I think, in attending to it, we can see, you know, what would later come to be the region of Southeast Asia as something other than merely the byproduct of imperial war objectives and military divisions and sort of a concept from Britain specifically. And I'm thinking of this also in reference to Niall Green's contribution to this conference and thinking about commensurability and the European loan concept and word of Asia. And with regard to Southeast Asia, while it is also, you know, all these things, I do want to foreground the ways in which trans-imperial kind of collaboration, consciousness, and interaction and comparison does help create a sense of region, or create a structure upon which a sense of region can emerge that isn't merely a sort of byproduct. One of the other things is, you know, in this time period, the anti-colonial collaboration that, you know, that I've studied, where Filipinos are redrawing their geographies of political affinity along a score of colonial repression and anti-colonial kind of collaboration and comparison, ends up enshrining Asian cities as places where they could enjoy greater political freedom, such as Hong Kong, and building that into their geography of political revolution. Abutting empires in the region created inadvertent safe havens for the colonized of one empire to operate outside the regime of oppression found at home, yet remain just next door. And Pan-Asianism as a network operated mainly by means of meeting and movement in and through major cities. One of the Filipino propagandists, you know, writes, quote, "Just as Trinidad was the asylum of those persecuted by the suspicions of the Spanish regime in continental America, Hong Kong has become the haven for the sons of the Philippines," end quote. And it boasts freer atmosphere, greater liberty and respect, and inviolability of the home. And it's only there that the sons of the Philippines, he writes, found the peace, tranquility, and respect that they lacked at home. And its proximity, in fact, also helps to underscore the local setting, right? And, you know, they write about a long history of Cochin China and on British Malaya, and, you know, and they ask, who is not reminded of the Philippines in reading these lines? Solamente es sin miserias tener socios, you know, it's comforting to have partners in adversity. Jose Rizal, the future national hero of the Philippines, is a sort of precursor and parallel to Pham Boi Chau of Vietnam, in that they both kind of designed a sort of Zhongzhou movement, a Go East movement, with, you know, seeking to establish schools in Japan for sort of Asianist-style education. Rizal tries to establish one in Hong Kong, and Pham Boi Chau does establish one in Japan. And, you know, and Hong Kong seemed to the propagandists, Filipino propagandists, to be a place of relative freedom where acquiring education, advancing, and speaking in the language of the colonizers were done freely and were not considered inherently suspicious. And the global imaginary that informed various Asian nationalisms, and the trans-imperial kind of comparison that informed them at the turn of the 20th century, created various visions of Asia which were themselves central and grounding to those nationalisms, and so are embedded within them. And, you know, I was reminded again of Rebecca Carl's sort of thinking through of this and staging the world, examining the ways in which Chinese identification with what would become known as the Third World produced key planks of the Chinese nationalist discourse. It made legible the international modern world in which Chinese nationalism was situated. Meanwhile, in the Third World itself, in the Philippines, broad Asian identification with Chinese civilization and its ancient glory, but not its present-day Chinese immigrants in their midst of the colonies, and with the rise in Japan and its modern achievements, were foundational to emerging Filipino national consciousness and anti-colonial and transnational anti-colonial kind of collaboration. I think that the last thing I also wanted to say about this is the Filipino propaganda movement used its constructed Asia, to which the Illustrados attached the Filipino nation historically and racially as a political tool in their claims against Spain and as a component of their national consciousness and racial awakening, as well as a ground for their future sovereignty. But this process is different from the one that Rebecca Carl described among the reformist Chinese, because Carl was sort of thinking through, the problem of how a diachronically Darwinian staged world could be constituted as an active site of global reimaginings in the Chinese intellectual perspective, within the context of overwhelming Euro-American Japanese power, and how this creates a sort of imminent stage upon which the Chinese could act. And this is very different from the Filipinos, who are sort of less wary of these sort of hierarchies of power and are seeking to kind of ride on its coattails. And I think that is something that makes Southeast Asia a little bit different than East Asia in the time period that I'm looking at. But beyond some of the examples I draw on from Vietnam and China and the Philippines, I also found in the same time period, from the other side, vestiges of not just the intra-Asian plane operating below the Western Transimperial one, but also an operative regional European plane alongside its Transimperial one, and seeking to define, when does the region of Europe come into play, and when is it sort of, inter-imperial competition, what is the space of the Transimperial here, and I won't take up our time now to, detail it, but one of the things I talked about in the paper I prepared for today was a kind of view from the decks of the ships that came to observe the Battle of Manila in 1898, when all the leading imperial powers, including Japan, were present and watching there in the water, sort of anxiously checking, sort of observing the balance of power and how things would play out with an eye to their own Asian colonies, as well as to the balance of power in Europe. And the role of the US here and what its future role would be. There's I sort of hew to or talk briefly about a French observer, a lieutenant, who talks about the presence of the pan-imperial shield of Europe, and what would be done for the good of Europe and what wouldn't, and then how quickly that breaks down and when it does and when it doesn't. So yeah, that's all I think I wanted to say by way of introduction to the panel. Thank you so much for having me today. I look forward to our discussions.
Yes? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Cyrus. Thank you, David, and thank you to the Fondation for putting on this wonderful event and to bringing us all here. In the text that I sent, I used a book that I really need to finish and that some of you have heard me talk about before, as an example of my, other work as well, that in different constellations addresses the conceptions and interactions between different scales and of levels of engagement, so nation, empire, region, global. And the book examines the colonial roots of European cooperation in the interwar period by looking at European movements in France and the Netherlands, so not France and Britain, in the interwar period. And it examines concrete imperial ties and projects, as well as broader imperial mindsets and contestations of these very much as well. And I'm mostly interested in non-state actors, although these, coming back to the discussion in the previous panel, these individual often combined multiple functions, and hard and fast lines are hard to draw between state and non-state, and also that they constantly jump scales from regional to imperial to national, and that relates also to what Nicole was just saying. So I would say I'm more interested in the transimperial than in the interimperial in this sense. And that brings me to thinking about the subject matter of the book, because it can be seen as transimperial. You could do this in an interimperial way as well. You can think of it transnationally, you can think of it internationally, but it can also be understood historiographically to be at the confluence of transimperial, interimperial, transnational, international, and or global approaches. And I think there are, well, let me first make a first point, is about the distinction between and possible sometimes simultaneous overlap between subject matter on the one hand and approach on the other. Because in our discussions, they sometimes sort of merge. And I think even though they sometimes actually overlap, it's also good to draw them out a little bit. And then to come to the book, my argument for the need to look at the colonial roots of European cooperation relates to three frameworks that were used to argue for European cooperation by European actors in the interwar period. And that's geopolitics, economics, and civilization and race, sort of together. And I argue that the importance of these frameworks is due to changes to global order following World War I, not World War II as the traditional historiography on European cooperation suggests. To give you an example, okay, now you can actually hear me. I'll give you an immediate example of Coudenhove-Kalergi, the founder of the Pan-Europa Union. He said that after World War I, the world had emancipated itself from Europe. And to use Coudenhove a little bit more, in relation to the geopolitical framework, he saw the world as divided into 5 force fields, as he called them: Pan-America, the British Empire, Pan-Europe, the Soviet Union, and Asia. And this also includes various conceptions of Pan-Asianism. So in a way, I would have loved to have coffee with Nicole to talk about this more. And his main point was that these force fields, except for Europe, were all on the rise, and Europe was in crisis in some way. For the economic framework, I wanted to use French economist Francis Deleuze as an example. And the basic thinking in economic terms was that before World War I, Europe had been this central node in the world economy, in a global economic system, and World War I had showed that trade could also flow around Europe. It didn't have to go through Europe necessarily. And in his book, which was called Les Deux Europes, The Two Europes, Deleuze, well, he talks about, no, let me start differently. In the historiography on this book, on the two Europes, it always talks about the industrial Europe and the agricultural Europe and how they have to work together. And it's very much a Euro-European story. Actually, but if you read the book, you understand why Deleuze starts why he argues why these two need to work together. And that's because of the third Europe. And he actually spends 2/3 of the book talking about the third Europe, which he sees as former or continued settler colonies, so including Latin America, even the US, and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa. And his argument is that these were basically along the lines of Coudenhove emancipating themselves. And that is the reason why the two Europes within Europe need to work together. But the reason is not just a European reason, it's very much an extra-European reason. And for the last frameworks about civilization and race, and that is quite similar to what Ulrike Linder will, I think, talk about, I'll come back to Coudenhove to give you an example. A long story short, he saw Asia understood as everything between Casablanca to Tokyo, so very much also North Africa, through a civilizational lens. And he saw, and with him many others, Africa through a racial lens. And that meant that Asian colonies couldn't be counted on as a power base for Europe. Just like the settler colonies, these also couldn't be counted on as a power base. And the contestations of claims for European civilizational superiority and empire by anti-colonialists across Asia and North Africa, in this sense, also spurred Europeanist discourse. And in the face of these challenges, Europeans needed to cooperate and they needed to turn to Africa. So that's where I get to the last point. And to sort of think about what a transimperial approach does here, it means that you can bring together works like Tim Harper's Underground Asia into conversation with Oswald Spengler, Die Untergang des Abendlandes, or Gaston Rioux, Europe ma patrie, with his very racist outlook. But I think these things normally live in different worlds, but if you take this perspective, you actually see that they sort of address similar points. Now, this brings me to the last point, to Euro-Africa. Ideas about Euro-Africa came in many guises, and perhaps Florian will touch upon them as well. And because they came in many guises, they can also be studied from many angles. Well, not entirely because of that, but they can. And I guess an inter-imperial perspective has tended to look at the official mind and or joint projects on the ground between various empires. A transimperial approach might foreground the role of non-state actors, looking at connections through not necessarily thinking in empires as units of analysis. A regional perspective tends to focus on European plans for Africa, or take Europe and Africa as the terrain, as do most studies of Euro-Africa, which makes sense because it is about Europe and Africa. But what I would actually like to emphasize is that the reason why Euro-Africa became relevant has to do with changes to global order and to these conceptions of Asian colonies no longer being able to count on, the power base in settler colonies no longer being there, the role of the Soviet Union leading communism and stirring these anti-colonial revolts in the Asian colonies, and thus also having repercussions in Europe. So in that sense, and this is where I get to sort of my conundrum, and that was actually a question that I was thinking of asking Nadine earlier. So how, I keep going backwards and forward. Is the best approach in this, for this bit, is it transimperial or is it global? And I know that, well, the whole discussion about global history, are we done with it? I haven't made up my mind yet. So that's sort of where I think I'll leave it. Whether transimperial will, a perspective, so not talking about topic, will bring me what I want to show, or whether it's not actually more useful to look at it from a global perspective, because perhaps not everything here is related to empire. Thank you.
Well, in spite of the fact that now I understand that conference is poorly organized because it doesn't have siesta on the schedule, I'm very grateful to the organizers for bringing me here. Now, I'm going to bring you to the 18th and 19th century and to this other Europe, this Central and Eastern Europe. And this is the period when there are no nation states. This is the time of empires and nationalism. And I would argue that the four empires I'm going to talk about form a special macro system of empires: Ottoman, Habsburg, Hohenzollern, and Romanov empires, are so closely tied together that although all empires are in one way or another entangled with each other, these empires are entangled in particular way. First of all, here in this region, borders move often and in dramatic fashion. Much more often and much more dramatically than in what we now call Western Europe. I'm not talking about 20th century or 21st century, but if you ask me, I will tell you later. They not only move in reality, but they also have a huge potential of further moves on the minds of people who plan their political action at that time and also later on. These borders also are porous, and money, ideas, and people move across these borders, and they move not only like settlers in one direction, but they also move seasonally as Gastarbeiters. And Germans developed the system of kicking people out before they managed to settle exactly in the 19th century, targeting Jews and Poles who were Russian subjects in this region. Now, these empires were so closely related to each other, entangled to each other, that if one empire was doing something in her internal politics that would immediately, whether they wished it or not, influence the neighboring empires. Consider, for example, changes in policy towards Poles, and of course the partitions of the Polish Commonwealth was a very important element in this system. So if say, Brits decided to support a Polish movement against the Russian Empire in the 19th century, which they did on a systematic basis, that didn't influence internal politics in Britain at all. But if Austrians would try to support Poles against Russia, that would have immediate impact in their domestic politics, of course. Now, another thing which, so when we talk about entanglements, we have to realize that the density and qualitative differences in these entanglements are in game. Second, the question of empire building and nation building. Here, well, I'm coming back to what Paul Kramer was talking about when he said nation-building empires. For me, nation-building empires are first of all about empires who are building nations in their core areas, in their metropolis. And we should understand that it is not nations who were building empires, but empires who were building nations, be it Spanish, French, Russian, German. Habsburgs might look as an exception, but only in the Cisleitanian part. Because if we look at Transleitania, under the Hungarian rule, after Ausgleich, they are extremely efficient in pursuing French strategy of assimilation and nation building. It's only Trianon which destroyed their effort, which was actually really very successful. Don't forget that Hungarians were the third numerous group in Budapest just in 1870s. Now, when we look at this system, we also have to ask a question about state and non-state actors, imperial and non-imperial actors, and who played whom. It's interesting. Let me give you an example of just one story. At a certain moment, Russian old believers lost their last bishop, so they couldn't reproduce hierarchy. We are talking about millions of people. And what are they doing? They mobilize one of the Orthodox patriarchs from Istanbul. They bring him to Biała Krynica, which is in the Habsburg Empire, where he restores old believers' hierarchy. And partly it is a result of cooperation of empires with these guys, but to a very large extent it is the ability of these guys to play the empires for their own purposes. And don't forget that old believer communities also are very numerous in the Ottoman Empire. To engage also the German Empire, I would give you another example briefly. When the Russian Empire decides that Lithuanians should publish only in Cyrillics, in their own Lithuanian language, but in Cyrillics. When Lithuanians decided that it's not going to work, they rely heavily on a small group of Lithuanians which lives under the Prussian rule. In the 20th century, all these Lithuanians were already assimilated, but for the history of Lithuanians under the Russian rule, they played a very important role, and so on. So the question here is, for the period we are talking about, when we say inter-imperial, we are talking about exactly interactions, connections, restraint, cooperation between imperial structures. But trans-imperial means for me various processes which were not necessarily controlled by empire, but were crossing the borders of empires. And for this region, it was extremely important because there were many ethno-religious communities, ethno-confessional communities, who were cut by the imperial borders. The least would be dozens, starting with Poles, Jews, of course, Armenians, Romanians, Ukrainians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and so on and so forth. So, to sum up, this system was stable until these empires engaged themselves in a war which had a very different character compared to the wars of the 19th century. Because the wars of the 19th century were about some military exercises which would end up in negotiations and peace treaty after usually several months or maximum 1-2 years. While the First World War became the war which had total character and which was about survival of empires. And that meant that they pulled out this double-edged sword of supporting ethnic and religious separatism across the front line. And as a result, the significance and resources of national movement increased dramatically in the course of the First World War. And that is part of the memory in the region about how things are being done, which influences a lot the behavior of contemporary actors in the region. Thank you very much.
So I think my presentation should show up now. Oh, wonderful. Here it is. This is magic. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Thanks to the organizer for putting this wonderful event together. Very impressive lineup and very inspiring discussions so far. As it has been indicated to me that the time regime will be mercilessly handled here, so I start without further ado, not without a small caveat mentioning that I'm not quite sure if I have so much to say about regions, but nevertheless, let's see where it takes us. So I start let's go back by explaining the title perhaps a little bit, The Clash of Empire or the Changing of the Guard, is the question: how are the British Empire in South Asia, the Raj, and the emerging American empire? An empire I would define at that stage as an empire of soft power. How are they interacting and interrelated? By looking at two various aspects: the aspects of US influence, so the more subtle cultural type of interaction, and the aspect of intervention, I would say in this case as a UC example of intervention on the philanthropic and educational level. I start with a brief overview of how the perception of the British Empire in the United States developed during the 19th century. These two gentlemen are the most well-read authors being read in America, informing Americans about the realities of India during the 19th and early 20th century. And they stand for two, and this is my basic argument, two very different positions. There is one tradition that America is very critical, having been a colony itself that could shake off American colonialism, very critical about the British Empire and constantly trying to castigate the oppressive character on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is a second position with it's quite positive and admiration for the achievements of British imperialism. One could say, if you look at the timeline, then in the early 19th century, roughly until the mid 19th century, where there is a certain American presence that is due to the heavy economic relations that are established immediately after the emergence of the American Republic, and there is a presence of American merchants, of American mariners in India, and when they write letters back home and describe the situation in India, they are really critical, trying to expose this oppressive character, the kind of tyranny that has taken place in their own country. This is what they mercilessly describe is happening in South Asia as well. So this view by an American merchant based near Delhi in 1818 is fairly representative of, we could cite dozens or more of this similar type of descriptions of the type that is castigating American imperialism. This changes towards the second half of the 19th century, and the important event here, there are two important events. On the one hand, there's the American Civil War, but shortly before that, there's the mutiny in India, this great rebellion, or First War of Indian Independence in nationalist parlance, which leads to, this is covered worldwide, of course. I mean, also check this in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung. There are dozens of articles on that, but it's very lively discussed in the American public sphere, in the American press. And there you could see still some criticism. The British their empire is dysfunctional, they have not handled this right, we should do it better. But overwhelmingly, there's a strong sense of what one could call racial solidarity and sympathy for this imperial project. And what is striking is that there are two ways of very frequent comparisons. On the one hand, it is the rebellion of Indian soldiers and later on farmers is compared to the atrocities of Native Americans committed on white settlers in the States. On the other hand, especially in the Southern papers, one refers often to potential slave rebellions that might occur, and this is seen as the moment where racial solidarity is required. And although there is slight criticism about the harshness, the general consensus is this firm hand is needed. So towards the end of the century and the beginning of the 20th century, we have the consolidation of this Anglo-Saxonism, where it is seen as one family. There is also very strongly, at least, the attempt of Britain to circulate this ideology of Greater Britain, including this entire family. And this has some purchase in the US too. Probably the most well-known expression is Theodore Roosevelt, who was, as you see here, a big fan of the British Empire, describing especially the British rule in India as one of the greatest achievements of the white race of the past centuries. However, it must not be forgotten that this was a very, visible or audible dominant voice, but there was also criticism, and he was attacked in an open letter, which was more or less the birth hour of a strong India lobby in the United States that emerged around that same time and continued to gain an influence until actual Indian independence in the 1940s. So this is the very backdrop, and here come two case studies, two vignettes I wanted to present. So the first one in my soft power argument would be the empire of philanthropy. I might as well have christened it the empire of expertise, coming back to the issue of this scientized technocratic language that is gaining ground during this period. And you see here one of the centers of this American philanthropic agency. This is the headquarters of the Young Men's Christian Association in Madras, southern India. It starts a bit earlier, so the first very open formulation of an American sense of superiority vis-à-vis the British Raj and open criticism against their practices occurs in the 1890s, when American missionaries, in this case the American Marathi mission, is describing the situation in very bleak terms. There are several famines in short sequence, and they are raising funds in the United States. So the subtext being Britain and British imperialism is not able to handle its problems, not able to feed the population. This is the opportunity for American Christianity or Christian America to present itself and come to their aid. So they raise the funds, they organize large-scale shipments, so there's food aid, and this entire project is sanctioned by the US Congress, which sees it as a wonderful opportunity, as an advertisement for American agriculture to show that we can deliver, So it's sort of overlapping this philanthropic missionary interest with the interest of an emerging economic superpower as well, and this is taking place, and they make sure that on each piece delivered, it is very clear this is US aid. It's not done via the channels of the British administration. It's handed out by American missionaries to make clear this is also this national marker. We are providing this kind of aid for an empire which is largely dysfunctional. And very often this goes hand in hand with this kind of criticism, where you say the work of civilization is done by American do-gooder missionaries, whereas John Bull is pumping his resources into suppressing the liberal aspirations of the Boers in southern Africa. So that is very often coupled with this kind of accusation, harking back to this old pattern, of course, of the oppressive British tyranny. Yeah, and then let's have a look at the work of the YMCA. One of their biggest selling points was their program of sports and physical education, which was seen as an entry point. If you read this source, they were providing in their centers, in their YMCA headquarters, they were providing courses in all kinds of team sports, but also physical training and gyms. So the circulation of the gym is closely connected to the activities of the YMCA. And they were seeing this clearly as an entry point, and we are needed. Our expertise is needed here. We have developed in our institutions in Massachusetts a scientific way of training, providing education, and that is precisely what opens the hearts and minds of these communities. The British, again, completely outdated, have their military type of drill. If they have any physical training at all, we can do better. And so here we come to the cooperation part. The British acknowledged this superior expertise, and they include it in their imperial setup and hire YMCA-trained experts to open an institution, the Madras College of Physical Education, which until Indian independence has trained almost 2,000 Indian sports teachers of all the colonial provinces. So this is sort of an outsourcing of this very important task of citizen crafting and character building to this non-governmental American institutions. And the YMCA say, okay, we don't care. The important thing is that we are shaping them and that is very often stressed in the North, according to the modern democratic North American way of building up your body. This also extended to a particular current of knowledge, which unfortunately has often been forgotten, but it was a very standing trope in the 1900s, 1910s, called boyology. So how to deal with children at the age, say, from 6 to 16. They were also addressed in these YMCA institutions through the opening of scientific playgrounds. And as you can see here, that was the outspoken claim that they firmly believe that these transplanted American institutions will play a significant part in the upbuilding of the new India, completely circumventing the existing colonial states. And we are shaping the characters and minds according to our particular visions. So, and what is also striking, if you look at the personal correspondence or diaries of those YMCA workers, you find very clear statements of being extremely critical to Britishers. Statements such as indecision, lack of push, and pig-headedness are quintessential British qualities. Sorry, Martin. The old boys are nothing but foolish old bull-headed lime juices. So these are interesting statements which clearly show there is this sense of superiority. So the British Empire is in this outdated Victorian structure, and the real energy, the real drive comes from the United States. So with that, let's turn to the empire of entertainment. Have a look here at the ballroom of the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay, India, where by 1936 you have an American swing band playing a regular gig for several months. And the question would be, what is the role of American movies and music in India's jazz age, if there was such a thing? My argument here would be focused on certain spaces or enclaves of this type of American forms of mass culture and entertainment. One, these movie palaces. It has been argued by historians of Indian film that there was a sort of a cinema apartheid in India. So film was well established already by 1900, 1905 at a very early point of view. But after the First World War, Hollywood productions dramatically gained in presence. So by 1930, there were almost 80% of the films screened were films of American production. So there were hundreds, if not thousands, of small corner cinemas presenting films of Indian making for native low-class audiences, and there were these posh film palaces that became sort of meeting grounds for Europeans, all kinds of expats, but also for quote-unquote, that was the parlance of the time, educated natives, who would have a cosmopolitan space of encounter, which, for one thing, also allowed access to European women to see the Mem Sahib from very closely was not so easy in other constellations in this very race-conscious imperial structure. Cinema halls were, in that sense, very special places of encounter. So the British became very concerned about this, not least when in the 1920s more and more films, gangster movies, but also Hollywood love stories showing kisses on screen and so on, were in the eyes of the British observers threatening the racial prestige of the ruling British elite, and saying that if the natives who are only at best half educated see half naked women on screen, see violence, see constant consumption of alcohol, they get a completely wrong impression of Western civilization. So they reacted with censorship. One could argue if this is indeed the case. They reacted with censorship, so quite a few of these American movies were prohibited or had to be cut to be shown to native audiences, which is interesting. At this point in time, very, very few, if any, I think it's the first case in the late 20s or even 1930 that an Indian film is prohibited or has to be cut, but the American productions were seen as poisonous, undermining the entire structure, this ideological substructure of British rule. Yeah, and if you see in the background, these Indian film fans are heavily interested in Western movies. Let's come to my last point, music. Again, one could make a similar argument that jazz music, and back then, one has to remind today's audience, jazz was a music for dancing. So that was very popular. That was about, men and women dancing together also. And here too, I would argue there are certain privileged spaces of encounter, these enclaves like very posh restaurants like Firpos in Kolkata, or again, the already mentioned ballroom of the Taj Mahal Hotel in Bombay, which featured regular jazz entertainment. But this, of course, is only a part of the story. There is also the economic dimension to it. You need, of course, there was also the export of gramophones, the hardware on radio sets, but also the software, records were imported. And the same, by the way, holds true for film. There was also this commercial aspect to it, and one of the concerns next to the racial prestige was that this is advertisement for American products. And one of the proponents of the American film industry also said that for every foot of celluloid, we are selling products for $10 in all over the world. So that is working. The same for this entire jazz culture. This was not only about music, about dancing. This was also about fashion. This was about alcoholic beverages and cigarettes, and so on and so forth. An entire, one might say, youth culture that spread at this point in time, very, selectively in these urban centers first, and then by the late 1920s, you see regular tours of American jazz musicians. This was, again, more trans-regional. It also covered they would continue from India to Singapore to the Dutch colonies as well, ending in Hong Kong, Shanghai, or even up to Japan on the same tour circuit. And by 1993, this is very interesting, African-American jazz musicians decided that Bombay or Calcutta would be a decent home base, because they had lost possibilities of income in Europe. This is also a bit of global history with the government of Léon Blum. There was a quota of foreign musicians introduced in France, and dozens of the American musicians who used to work in France looked for a career elsewhere in Latin America, or in this case, even in India. What is interesting is, in a very race-conscious society like this colonial constellation, how would African-American musicians be treated? Now, perhaps counterintuitively, they were celebrated. They were not treated as black persons. You could be harsh to your chaprasi in the next moment, and then in the evening go to take part in this cosmopolitan jazz concert experience. They were representatives of American liberal modernity and not seen as black persons. So the US pianist Teddy Weatherford, who lived in India for more than 15 years, wrote back home, well, I like India because they treat us white folks fine. Yes, and that brings us back to the illustration on my opening slide, which showed us Calcutta during the war years. All of this intensified dramatically between 1942 and 1946, when 250,000 GIs were stationed all over the Indian subcontinent. And all these interfaces were more and more not only European elites or the very well-heeled natives, but also the not so well-heeled secondary elites would come into touch with this kind of cultural influences. Yes, then the radio played, of course, a big role. Like in Europe, AFN stations also spread the gospel of this kind of American mass culture all over the subcontinent. So with that, let me come back to Nadine's checklist. So we have seen connectivity, definitely. There was a good deal of cooperation, but definitely there was also competition between these two empires. One empire relying on military power and administrative structure and social distance, and a completely different type of, one could say, deterritorialized soft empire who made inroads and created niches in the existing structure. So then we can turn back to the initial question, was it a clash of empires or a changing of the guard in the sense that one empire was replaced by another? I think when I reflect on it, neither was true, actually. So it was not leading to a complete Americanization. It remained very patchy, and in the long course of history, it remained a sideshow, and America's purchase very rapidly increased after independence. So this leads me to the insight that I could shorten the title, and with that, I end.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for our presenters. We now enter in the Q&A. I think there's a lot of Qs and maybe some As also coming. So I don't know if I have several questions here that have come in online, but maybe we'll take a few in-house first and then move on from there. So let's start over there. Martin, yeah. Maybe if you can just, whenever you ask questions, just, we are all good friends by now, but just to remind everybody who you are.
Yeah, sure. Martin Duesenberg from the University of Zurich. I have a question for Harold, if I may. Although between pig-headed British and excessive Americanism, I'm not quite sure what's left to say. the question I have relates to actually a question that Paul raised, the very first question that he raised in his paper. Where's Paul? He's over there. Which is to do with whether inter-imperial interaction shapes modes of national and imperial self-making. And here I'm just thinking about national self-making. I wonder if the framework for your presentation is sort of two empires, Britain and America, right? But I wonder if there's a triangulation that you could bring in there about whether the ways in which Indian people saw this competition and mutual undermining of empires contributed to Indian nation-making.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That, of course, is part of the larger project, actually, so I framed it towards this trans and inter-imperial interaction for this talk. Of course, they realized there is a difference, and that was part of, I mean, especially the YMCA strove very hard to show we are not British, it's different, and we are showing you a path to a different modernity. So it was easier to join these American institutions, say educational offerings, but especially these sports facilities and courses that were being offered. Many, especially in the 1920s, 30s, when nationalism was gaining momentum, it would have been very unpatriotic to go to, say, a British Boy Scout group or use these sports facilities, but they did their utmost to make clear you can come to us. We are not, we have been a colony ourselves. So that was definitely there, and what happened is that it was appropriated. So many of the, especially patriotically or nationalistically inclined Indians would rather come up, what I call, I've been criticized for that, they came up with pirate copies, creating institutions very similar to these YMCA institutions. For instance, these headquarters, 4-story buildings where you would have a library, where you would have rooms for science demonstration, educational purpose, where you had could also live on the 3rd floor, and then you had the gym on top of it, of course, which was the centerpiece. That was copied by various movements, nationalistic movements, without the sea, without taking away this Christian sort of subtext and meaning of it. Also, the Annie Besant, theosophical leader, and at that point very deeply involved in nationalist agitation, was opening such a facility in Madras in the 19-teens.
Great, thank you. Mona, maybe?
Hi, I'm Mona Bieling. I'm a PhD student from here, actually. My question is also for Harald Fischer-TINÉ. I was wondering, because in your second and third case study, the music and the jazz, women do play a tiny role, or at least they are mentioned. In the YMCA case, however, I was wondering, because arguably women, and especially female bodies, play such an important role in colonialism and colonial and imperial ideas of, race, segregation, fertility, and so forth. So I was wondering whether you have come across any trans-imperial global ideas of also shaping the female body in these.
Yes, very much so, and also in the case of jazz and the Hollywood movies, female bodies played a crucial role, even that if they had to be hidden or that was a constant point of reference. Of course, there was also a YWCA, not as well equipped and not financially as potent as the YMCA, but from the late 1890s onwards, they were present. And my earliest find is from 1900s, 1909 or 10, that they wrote back to the headquarters in the States, and we need physical directors to train Indian women. That was a very delicate sort of challenge that they said, and then as far as I know, from the 1913 or 14, the first women specially prepared to train Indian female bodies to become more well-rounded and also more effective in the sense. I mean, this was something which happened in the context of the First World War, when women also working for the Red Cross and in other functions were entering the public sphere to some extent, when this became acceptable. And then in the interwar years, you have this is spreading. I mean, again, copied or started at the same time, and there were also other sources. I wouldn't say that the YWCA is the only one here, but they certainly were one of the first. Many of these nationalist Indian organizations would do this as well, seeing that preparing female bodies, after all, they have to be, they are representing the nation with their bodies, and then in very peculiar terms, as this was the time in the 1920s, 30s of Hindu-Muslim violent conflicts and riots. Women who knew how to protect themselves and their bodies from being degraded and defiled were seen as crucial, and that was why this then became acceptable. There is, by the way, a current project going on precisely this question at my chair.
Great, thank you. Just to point out, Nicole is also with us online. So, if, any questions there? I don't know if anybody in the panel wants to react to anything so far said by anybody, but we have questions, lots of questions. So let's go there and then over to go ahead.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much for your presentations. I'm Miguel Jerónimo. Isabelle, I would like to listen a little bit about what you consider to be specifically defining of the interwar period regarding all these ideas about the relevance of Euro-Africa, essentially. What would you single out as something that changed in the interwar period compared to what was imagined before First World War, and what we would think lasted after the Second World War and the rise of the UN global regime, and also to HARALD quickly. So especially the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century was surely a moment in time of what we could call the intensification of the internationalization of indignation about colonial empires. What a colleague of ours called the civilized savagery that was identified to many ways of many forms of ruling in European colonial empires. And I wonder to what extent your story also fits there, considering, for instance, the huge importance of the transatlantic missionary philanthropy that actually connected in many, many ways, including the circulation of information, testimonies, images, pictures later on, etc., to this, what we could call transimperial history of violence, colonial violence.
Great, thanks. Perhaps we can take a second question and then respond to those. Can you pass the microphone over to you? Just because there's a lot of questions, I want to take as many as we can.
Thank you, Ulrike from Cologne. So one question for Harald. I was wondering about the race question in the YMCA, because what I gather from Africa, there they catered for British people. For example, in South Africa, it was open in 1860s, and they only wanted to cater for British young people. And why did they do that in India for Indian guys? I mean, because in Africa, what I got, they didn't do it. And how did they class it? And how was the race question coming in? And to you about Coudenhove-Kalergi, I was wondering, I mean, Coudenhove-Kalergi wasn't very successful. He was not at all. I mean, he got the Karls Prize after the Second World War, but his ideas weren't taken up not very much. I mean, not everything. And so I was just wondering, isn't there also a question why when the European Union was founded, there was still Algeria as a department of France, and no history of the European integration reflects on that. I mean, it's just it's a history of peace, but the Algerian War was actually taking place in a part of the newly established European Union, and this is never connected. So I'm just wondering. So it's just maybe for later discussion, not you.
Great, thank you very much. Anne-Isabelle, you have two questions, I think, to attack here.
Thank you for
and
those
then Harald.
questions. Miguel, about the First World War. So I guess this also shows how we all, like, it's different historiographies, and in the historiography on European cooperation, and that also relates to your question in a way, it's very much this Second World War onwards story. And I think that's hugely problematic because the 9th of May just passed, was last week, no, this week. And, you know, it's not as if Schuman woke up that day, had a brilliant idea, and everybody said, okay, let's go and do it. There's a long prehistory. And that will also bring me to Coudenhove's point, about Coudenhove in a minute. So in that sense, what changes with World War I, so this is a corrective to that narrative that starts in the Second World War. There are obviously these ideas before the First World War, also very much during the First World War, but, and I think during and after the First World War, there is this realization that the position of Europe in the world is just, it's no longer what it used to be. And this is very much the Spenglerian idea of the Untergang des Abendlandes, and you know, there is Paul Valéry has a similar, wrote a similar book. I don't know if they would agree if I call them similar, but for the purpose here, they're similar. It's about Europe about the world emancipating itself. And I think that is something that you really see after the First World War, that this realization, as they see it, becomes relatively widespread and taken up. In the sense of how that plays out, if we then move forward, I think you see that moving forward as well, and that's why I sort of emphasize the point about these Asian colonies so much, is that if you start after the Second World War, then the relevance of losing Asia is in a way less, and you sort of immediately focus on Europe and Africa, whereas I think you need to move backwards to see the relevance of Asia, why Africa becomes so important. And obviously, Europe is even further provincialized after the Second World War, so you get sort of an intensification of that. But I would say that the First World War is this turning point for quite a few people. And at the same time, there is a tension, because if you look at European empires, they were at their greatest geographical extent after the First World War. So it's this weird thing, it's being at the epitome, and at the same time, this intense doubt of, like, how long can we hold this? And isn't this sort of like the point where we go down? Now, the question about Coudenhove. So I'm really happy, actually, that the European historiography is changing. And there is attention for this imperial and colonial aspect. Also, there is more work coming out on looking at how European colonies were integrated. Well, Véronique Dimier has long worked on this, obviously, and the role that they played. But it's sort of like that is being taken up. That's fairly recent. Why look at Coudenhove? I actually think that, well, talking about success, I think that's not what interests me necessarily, but what does interest me is that he was the touchstone. If you look at Europeanism in the interwar period, were you against or in favor of European cooperation, you had to address Coudenhove. He was the person that everybody at a certain point referred to, whether they agreed or disagreed. For many in the Netherlands, it was a reason why you should stay away as far as you can from European cooperation, because there was this crazy guy. Whereas there were other people who thought, well, we might not disagree completely, but we think we should do it differently. So in that sense, I think rather because he might be problematic, but he was not a systemic thinker, but he was so average in a way that actually makes him interesting. The Karls Prize, I mean, in terms of self-propaganda, he was very good at that. And his influence afterwards, I think, that diminishes incredibly. But in the interwar period, he did put up this propaganda machine that worked very well, and that brought this idea amongst large swathes of the population. And just a slight addition to the way he's been treated was generally very much in a European context and not looking at the rest of the world, which was fundamental to his understanding of why this was important.
Great, thank you very much. Harold, did you have a question? Can I
Yes.
just, I have plenty of questions for you actually online here, but maybe one of these that you could address at the same time is the question of, you used the term soft power quite a bit in your talk. So how would you define this? And how is it different? We talk today about Chinese soft power in Africa, right? Which I guess is somewhat different from the type of soft power you're referring. So
Yes.
that was a question from Shell and Wu online.
Yeah, let's go one by one. The first question was about this transatlantic missionary activism, and that was the wave. I mean, at the times, you know, when the Congo atrocities and all this happened, and missionaries played a crucial role in debunking this, giving it publicity. That was at a time when the agenda was not criticizing colonialism as such, but making it more moral or more humane. So at least in that sense, the American missionaries in India acted as well. So you rarely find a very, extreme statements saying this is an illegitimate rule, but you would say you have to live up to your civilized standards that you want to inculcate to the population. And the American missionaries were, by the way, the ones who had the first mobile cameras. So the pictures of victims, of famine victims, many of them were taken by American missionaries. So they fed into this campaign against the famine, raising awareness globally for these things happening, but not to the point where it would be the fundamental critique. That happens later on if we stay with the YMCA after the First World War. There's a short period in the early 1920s when there are suspicions that when the British CID is actually surveying the YMCA headquarters, there are suspicions that they are more or less Bolsheviks in disguise. The reason being that now you have more direct contacts, supportive voices for Indian nationalism, saying this is where the future lies, and the fact that several British Comintern agents were staying at the YMCA at Bombay. So that was a crisis, and they had to defend themselves that they were not part of this international conspiracy. Then the race question. There was a Bantu department of the South African YMCA opened in the early 1920s, run by an African-American missionary who had won his stripes in India in 1916, and during the First World War he was trained in Bangalore for a short time. Very fascinating personality. There is a 450 pages biography about him. So what is interesting that he, after 10-15 years working in the South African YMCA, where he had this strict racial segregation, by the way, also in the American YMCA until 1948, while critiquing the foolish old bullheaded lime juicers for being racist, that was, segregation was practiced in the States until 1948, where you had. So this guy then in the mid-30s gave up his work for the YMCA and joined the Communist Party. So, and now the soft power part. So,
can I just add to that soft power question only? Because
sure.
It's, in fact, ditto the same question, which is about to what extent are you comfortable taking a concept from modern day global politics, soft power, Joseph Nye, and its interpretation with in our past. I understand that gravity existed before Newton spoke about it, so soft power must have existed in that sense. But to what extent, methodologically, as a historian, are we comfortable taking stuff from there? And just one more question to Professor Miller, which is about, and immediately after that important point about siesta, you had also spoken that we could speak about 20th century and 21st century as well. The idea that your notion about nation building empires versus empires building nations to what extent does totalitarianism impact that equation? Thank you.
Okay. Harold, I guess back to you to complete your thoughts.
I would answer a bit along the lines of what we heard earlier with, can we use empire, or should we first define it precisely, or do we use it rather loosely and then look where it leads us? So one of the advantages is it marks clearly the difference between this empire relying on military power, the garrison state of British India, and a completely different type of informal influence that has economic dimensions, that has also the dimensions of, what later again anachronotically would be called winning the hearts and minds of people, imposing certain lifestyles and choices. And I think that is understood, and I would not say that I subscribe to this entire IR debates about soft power. That's not the way I want to have it understood.
Okay, great. Alexei?
I'm not sure that it's a good entry to this set of problems by implying the notion of totalitarianism, because, of course, you have in mind Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and they have very, very different approach to nation building. But I would put it this way. The Soviet experience was long enough to live beyond totalitarian stage, because, I mean, the late Soviet Union was, whatever you wish, not totalitarian, if you still want to use this concept. And the idea the question of how much Soviet nationality politics contributed to nation building in the area, and then how much the Soviet, so to say, refrigerator after the Second World War contributed to stabilization of the image of national territory and nations in Central Europe. It's a very big issue and very sensitive, because if you assign too much significance to this Soviet impact, of course, there are many people who are offended. On the other hand, if you do not pay enough attention to that, you end up in a very simplified picture.
Great. We have, you can, yeah, maybe make a stop here, here, and then here. So start here. Lady right there, hand up and everything. Yeah, thank you.
I have a question for Nicole. My question is whether there might be a legal dimension in what you described as the co-constituting relationship between the regional and the transimperial history, right? And so what does regionalism really mean? How is it practiced? How is it exercised historically? If we think about what it means for countries to be considered a region, can we think, in the same way that contemporary countries in the European Union have similar laws? Does the forming of the regions back in the late 19th, 20th century have anything to do with sort of transimperial legal transplantation, for instance, I'm thinking of Hong Kong as a sort of a safe haven for certain revolutionaries, and it's relevant to my own research, and so I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that.
That's great. Before you answer, maybe take two more questions. Ron, you had a question, and then let's go down here.
I was wondering, in that wonderful story you told about the Americans in Britain, in India, if you weren't using empire in two very different ways. So in one sense, the British, those lime juicers, are in fact, they have an empire. There's no question this is an empire. It's about one people being superior to the other. it uses coercion, all the rest. On the American side, without making any excuses for Americans, which I don't usually do, nevertheless, you could see this as a number of different things. Anti-imperial in some ways, cultural hegemonic in certain ways, in a kind of Gramscian sense. And there, I would say empire is metaphoric, rather than actually either accurately descriptive or analytical, that is, explanatory. That would be my take, because I love that paper and I love what you did with it, taking those kinds of examples from far afield to show that kind of hegemonic intervention, cultural intervention.
My question.
Is it exactly on this? Okay, well, let's take that and then we'll answer and then we go back to,
I have more, but I will leave that for later. So,
okay.
Okay. How about thinking, first of all, the Americans can be critical of the Brits in India only because the Brits let them in, right? So I think number one. Number two, how about thinking about it this way? The British, like zooming out, right? The British in 1931 do the Statute of Westminster with the different dominions. The United States obviously is an independent country, but as Hopkins, for instance, has shown, right, deep into the 19th century, on some levels, it stays very tightly related to Britain. Could we say that the British let the Americans in as sub-imperial contractors into interwar India, let them do certain things that they do well, that's fine, and that this is simply yet another instance together with the instances of Metro Britain reconfiguring its relationship with the white dominions in the 1920s and 30s.
Great. Okay. Tack, let's get some comments. So Nicole, I think you had a question there. You want to address that?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a really interesting thought about the legal dimension. I think that, our kind of natural structure for regions is legal or perhaps religious as the kind of first kind of construction materials for a region. And what I was thinking through here is what can construct a region or what is left to a region in the absence of that kind of superstructure or connecting structure. So a kind of neutered political engagement and a space where certain kind of symbolic rituals of politics and sovereignty can be acted out, and how that gets enhanced through a transimperial kind of frame. And also, the reason why I brought up Nile Green was, if this idea of the incommensurability within Asia. And so then what constitutes an Asia? In the period that I'm looking at, affect becomes the bridge to kind of make up for this lack of commensurability between different portions of this region in the making, being Southeast Asia. And I think also one of the things that makes up for that lack of commensurability is precisely the diverse imperial experiences that allow for comparison across and that help to stitch through a kind of commonality that can make up for commensurability through comparison. So that's what that would be, I guess, my response to that, at least in my period.
Thank you very much. And Harold.
Yeah, coming back again to the question of empire and soft power or hegemony. I don't think it was a conscious act by the British to let those Americans in and do the job, because it developed. We have this time chronological dimension. What they did in the beginning was offering prayer meetings, Bible classes, and serving tea. Nobody was interested. And after 10, 15 years, they realized more people are interested, actually, if we are building gyms and teaching them basketball. So that was something that developed, and I mean, the situation is also, if you look at the various regional headquarters, there was no, I mean, unified agenda to it. But what I would say, when the British realized they developed a certain expertise that they would recognize as superior to their own, they would try to hijack them for their project, and they would willingly accept this because that would give them access to so many souls. And by the 1920s, even this original Christian agenda of gaining souls and winning converts retreats to the background, and you find statements to, well, they might consider themselves Hindus or Sikhs or Muslim or whatnot, as long as they have internalized our Protestant American values. They are saved. So that was even that this Christian dimension recedes. And so this partly overlaps, and then there is this collaboration. Partly there's competition, as you have seen. And what makes it different, again, I think, from the Chinese soft power in Africa, is, again, there is no nation state behind an original plan. So there were no advice from the State Department, you go and undermine the entire empire and then we take over. It was happening on the ground. They were feeding information back to the State Department. Some of the ex-YMCA guys would end up there as consultants and so on, and the first generation of development experts could draw on their knowledge. But that was not, you know, a state-driven agenda in the first place. It was, at a certain point, economy plays a big role, and you have this entire attempt of selling then things American. Also, when you build these sports facilities, make sure or the entire gym is imported from the US. The football, you may take a British model, but not mainly the expensive stuff. So that was also part of this. And then lastly, what I think, when you said, to your point, saying this is not really empire, this might be what used to be called Americanization, or, you know, this kind of cultural hegemony, I have to think about French imperialism in its last phase in Algeria, when you had all these centres de regroupement, and people were taught living in their habitus, in their ways of consumption, adopting Western European lifestyles to make them long-term allies, right? And I think what the YMCA and other Americans did, the same thing, but 40 years earlier, without centre de regroupement.
Great. Okay. Louise, maybe? And then Michael.
Thank you. This is a question for Nicole. I was just so struck by your discussion of Pan-Asianism in the Philippines, which is, you know, usually this term Pan-Asianism is very much associated with East Asia, coming from Japan and China. Sometimes Turkish Pan-Asianism is also a kind of a discourse that's been studied, but it's really interesting to think about it coming from a place like the Philippines, and also, you know, the ways that kind of my understanding of the intellectual engagement or the purchase that Japanese Pan-Asian messages got in places like the Philippines were that, you know, there was a mixed reaction, and particularly in the Philippines because of the affinities with the divided loyalties, you know, and some elites being having certain affinities to the United States, that affinity was a kind of an effective block on the receptivity to Japanese messages of Pan-Asianism. But it seemed like in what your paper is suggesting is that there was a different, an alternative kind of Pan-Asian vision that was thinking about, connections between Southeast Asian states and between maybe, you didn't talk about India, you didn't talk about South Asia, but I wondered if you could say a little bit about that as well. You know, so just can you fill out a little bit your ideas about Filipino Pan-Asianism?
Great. Maybe we'll take two more. Michael, you had.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a question for Alexey. So if I understood you correctly, you were saying that the empires that you spoke about in the 18th and 19th century in Central and Eastern Europe were different in their inter-imperial entanglements, inter-imperial relations, whatever you want to call it, from Western European empires in the 19th century, in that once one of these empires that you talked about adopted some sort of domestic policy, in particular towards minorities, it immediately affected neighboring empires. Now, in principle, of course, as Nicole can probably tell you, right? I mean, if the French adopt a new policy towards the Chinese in Indochina, something happens in Batavia and something happens in Manila and so forth. Just not much happens in Amsterdam and Paris. So I guess that's the main difference, right? So, but I guess my question is this really a difference in terms of how inter-imperial entanglements work, or is it a difference that in the case of your empires, the whole separation between domestic and imperial policies doesn't work in the same way as it does for the overseas colonial empires, right? Where colonial policy is essentially a segregated policy domain.
Great. Can we? Thank you, Mike. Can we pass it on perhaps to Alexander, right? Yeah. And.
Thank you. Alexander Morrison, New College, Oxford. I have a question for Alexey as well. These sort of, I suppose, authoritarian, state-driven nationalizing projects which you get in the late imperial period in Russia, to some extent in the Ottoman Empire as well, is not one effect of these actually to hasten their collapse and dissolution? I mean, not just because they stimulate minority nationalisms, i.e. from those who are not included in this attempt at sort of core consolidation, but also because they alienate key elements of the older imperial ruling elite, most obviously the Baltic Germans in the Russian case. So, to what extent are they actually sort of, obviously they're aiming at consolidation because they think that, in a kind of social Darwinian world where you're up against, say, the Germans on one side, the Japanese on the other, you need to have that coherence in the ethnic core. But are they in fact sort of digging their own graves, as it were? And then a quick question for Nicole as well, which is, I'm afraid, based on my complete ignorance of Southeast Asian history. But I was intrigued again, as Jenny was, by your reference to Hong Kong as an important centre for Filipino nationalism. Is that sort of reciprocal? In other words, are there Vietnamese nationalists or Malay nationalists from French or British colonies in Manila, or is it something specifically to do with the legal regime in Hong Kong? And connected with that, I suppose, in terms of how regional solidarities are constructed, presumably colonial elite languages cut across these to some extent, whether it's English or French or Spanish. But are there languages that can cross those barriers? Malay, I suppose, or Chinese? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for the question. Shall we start with Nicole again, and then we come back to the house after?
Yes, thank you so much for your questions. So to go in order, and I'm going to bore David and Michael and people here who've heard me talk about this a million times before, but so the sort of Pan-Asianism that I'm referencing in the Philippines comes from my book, Asian Place, Filipino Nation, and the traditional way that we look at Asianism and Japan in the Philippines sort of starts kind of from what we know happened in World War II, and what we know happened under the Japanese across the region of Southeast Asia, and then sort of kind of looks backwards to see, okay, why did Pan-Asianism not have the same purchase in the Philippines as it did in other places, and kind of explain it backwards. But if you start out in the late 19th century, before kind of different paths sort of harden, before the kind of rise of the US and the sort of American century, and when there was still kind of a lot more sort of political experimentation, especially in the actual construction of the Filipino nation, you see much more diverse experimentation. And in particular, you see that there are two kinds of work. There's a sort of explicit Pan-Asianism in terms of collaboration in Japan and elsewhere in Asia with kind of like-minded Asianists. And then there's a sort of more intellectual and general Asianism, which is kind of a way of countering kind of European charges that the Philippines are sort of an anarchy of tribes and races. And it's a way of laying claim to a kind of position in this understanding of universal history and world history by laying claim to being part of Asia and thus being able to sort of be connected to a sort of idea of ancient civilizational grandeur through a kind of biological argumentation that puts the Philippines in the same kind of basket as China and in the same kind of modern basket as the rising Japan. It's also in this way a kind of social Darwinist strategy, a way to explain away the kind of material inequality at this point in time and see that it's not a permanent state. It's just part of a kind of the housing civilization that moves from east to west, and the kind of sort of struggle between nations in competition geopolitically, and sort of gives a key to how they would surmount that kind of position. But of course, as we know, over the century with the colonization by the US, it becomes just a more sort of effective, efficient strategy to ally with the US and try and rest on that kind of special US on Israel. It was kind of the most
Classy, time's up, I guess. Sorry, we lost you, Nicole. We lost you there a little bit towards the end. The connection went a bit haywire, but...
Okay, hold on. Can you hear me now?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
So if you can repeat the punchline at the end, that would be great.
I'm not sure where I got cut off, but basically to say that the U.S. is able to sort of co-opt a lot of the revolutionary feel and sort of channel it through kind of benevolent assimilation and that colonial effect. To move to the other question, Hong as a center for Philippine nationalism is the same for others of Manila. I think that less Manila being a center, same way that Hong Kong is. I think what happens is that, at least in Southeast Asia, the Philippine Revolution becomes this kind of flashpoint, and you see it reverberate across the region, across the 20th century, with Sukarno referencing it, all sorts of different people all over Southeast Asia also trying to lay claim, and also to some extent in China, lay claim to the Philippine Revolution and what it means. There are those that say that the Philippines was the first to really rise up for the good of Asia, not Japan, and that it embodies the real Asianist spirit. There's a lot of rhetoric in the Philippine Revolution about how they're going to lead their Malay brothers to the future. And so I think that it's a historical example that kind of lives on rather than Manila as a site. And that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about why Manila wouldn't be a site in return. And I'll have to think about that more. Lastly, about language, yes, there are other languages. There's the use of English, use of Malay, use of Chinese, and then, of course, the sort of just a brush script kind of conversations that's facilitated in Japan with Vietnamese, Korean, Chinese, and that Filipinos and others are sort of able to participate to some degree, to some extent, and though not in the same kind of natural way or the way that it's presented as being sort of natural amongst those of the former kind of Sinic world. There was one other question. Oh, South Asia. It's an interesting lacuna. It's an interesting lack, actually, I find, at least in the Philippine discourse. I don't think that's true elsewhere in Southeast Asia, but in the Philippines, the only reference that comes to it is kind of leaning on the Sanskritic roots to some of the Philippine languages and Philippine dialects, especially to the kind of written language that barely survives into the Spanish period. So it's really a more like intellectual, civilizational, historical argument rather than an active kind of consciousness or knowledge production.
Great, thank you. Alexei, I think you had.
Thank you for questions. Of course, there is a long tradition to distinguish between contiguous empires and overseas empires, saying that, okay, Russia was an empire, Britain or Spain had the empire, which is, of course, misleading, because when you look at what happens in British or Spanish metropole when empires collapse, you suddenly discover that the metropole is also an empire. But my point was not only that these empires are continental and contiguous, but they form a specific cluster. Because if you look at these four empires, two of them, Russia and the Habsburg Empire, have borders with other three. And two others have borders with two of them. And these borders all the time move. And you cannot tell the story of any of these empires without telling the story of other empire. Try to tell the story of the Habsburg Empire without German unification. Try to tell the story of Russian Empire without German unification. That brings me to the Baltic Germans. So Russian nation-building project, which develops through the 19th century, had this problem of Baltic Germans being a privileged noble group from the early 19th century, when certain brave general Yermolov, who made himself famous for killing a lot of people in the Caucasus, was invited by Tsar Nicholas, and the Tsar asks, "What can I do for you?" And the guy, Yermolov, he had a nasty character, and he said, "Your Majesty, promote me into German." But the real problem comes when Germany becomes a unified empire, and that makes the loyalty of the Germans puts it under the question mark. I would say that the mechanism is indeed similar to the Ottoman case, when all these mobilized diasporas, which were so instrumental for managing the empire, be it in Russia or in the Ottoman case, Greeks, Armenians, Greeks, and then Romanians. That is how to do. As soon as they got a nationalizing state of their own, their loyalty comes under question. But there should be certain limits to comparison between Ottoman and Romanov empires in the 19th century. In one case, we are talking about empire which is shrinking all the time. And the processes of nation building in the imperial core of the Ottoman Empire, they have the logic of cutting losses, so to say. The Russian Empire, during the last 2.5 centuries of her existence, was growing with an average speed of 50 square miles per day. And it was not contracting before the First World War. And despite of the fact that this is part of Russian paranoia that the state is going to collapse. In fact, they were all the time thinking about the 20th century as a competition of two empires, Romanov Empire and the American Empire, because they are continent-scale empires which are fit for this competition. So that means that Ottomans, when there is a nice story about an Ottoman big bureaucrat who promised his daughter that they travel Europe when she becomes 16. And of course, the girl thought that they are going to Paris. And she was very disappointed when father took her to Vienna. And she asked, but father, but why? And father said, you know, Paris will always be Paris, but the war is coming. Vienna is not going to be Vienna anymore. So it was, if we talk about, so to say, weak patience among European empires, Ottomans definitely occupy the first place, then come Habsburgs, then come Romanovs. So that is the difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Listen, there was a joke about the Ottoman Empire that I just recalled. It's a different kind of joke and much more recent. Somebody wondered why they named an empire after a piece of furniture. But that's, you know, that's something else. So listen, I am looking at the time. I feel compelled to we are, after all, in the you know, international city of humanitarianism. So I feel a coffee break is probably in order to respect your human rights and all the rest. Unless there were any last comments from the panel. Nicole, everybody's good. So maybe, yes, so I think it's time for a coffee break, which I think is in the usual environment. But before we go, perhaps we can all just thank the panel in the usual fashion.